I gave my cheating wife a way out. Oops. She missed it.
Edward Langston found the GPS tracker wedged behind his car's rear wheel well on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. His first thought wasn't betrayal. It was confusion. Who would want to follow a civil engineer who spent his days calculating load-bearing capacities and his evenings watering orchids? The small black device sat in his palm like a cancer diagnosis. Cold metal, blinking red dot. Someone had been watching him, tracking his every movement through the pristine streets of Seabright Hills. Edward's methodical mind began cataloging possibilities: corporate espionage, random crime, mistaken identity. Never his wife. That evening, Veronica swept into their modernist kitchen, wearing the smile that had launched 1,000 Instagram posts. Her lifestyle brand, Elevated Living with V, boasted 300,000 followers who hung on her every word about mindful mornings and authentic relationships. "How was your day, darling?" she asked, kissing his cheek with practiced warmth. Edward held up the tracker. "Found this on my car." Veronica's smile flickered, just for a microsecond, before reforming into concern. "That's terrifying. Should we call the police?" "Maybe," Edward said, studying her face. In 18 years of marriage, he'd learned to read the subtle tells that her audience never saw. The way her left eye twitched when she lied about her shopping expenses, how her voice pitched higher when she was hiding something significant. Both tells were firing now. "I'm sure it's nothing," Veronica continued, already moving toward the wine refrigerator. "Probably some corporate thing. You know how competitive your industry gets." Edward nodded slowly. His engineering firm, Langston and Associates, had landed several major contracts recently. Industrial espionage wasn't unheard of, though it seemed excessive for a mid-sized coastal operation. "You're probably right," he said, pocketing the device. That night, while Veronica edited content in her home studio, Edward sat in his study examining the tracker under a magnifying glass. Professional grade, military specification, expensive. This wasn't some amateur operation or random stalker's impulse purchase. His phone buzzed with a text from Miles Crane, his 32-year-old protege and heir apparent at the firm, running late for tomorrow's client meeting. "Can you handle the Peterson project solo?" Edward frowned. Miles had been increasingly unreliable lately. Missed meetings, extended lunches, vague explanations about networking opportunities. Still, the younger man's charm and ambition had made him invaluable for landing new contracts. Edward had been grooming him to eventually take over the business. "No problem. Everything okay? Just busy with some personal stuff. Talk tomorrow." Edward set the phone aside and opened his laptop. If someone was tracking him, he wanted to know who and why. Installing monitoring software took him 20 minutes, a skill learned during his engineering studies that proved unexpectedly useful. By midnight, he had alerts set up for any unusual activity around his house, office, or regular routes. 2 days later, the alerts paid off. Veronica had left her purse in his car after their dinner at Seabrook's most exclusive restaurant. Edward was returning it when his fingers brushed against an unfamiliar receipt tucked into the side pocket. Marina Bay Hotel, room 214, yesterday's date. His hands trembled as he stared at the paper. Veronica had claimed to be at a spa retreat yesterday. A digital detox day she'd announced on her social media before going dark for 12 hours. Edward's engineering mind began calculating probabilities. The GPS tracker, her recent behavioral changes, the missed calls she'd been taking in private, Miles's increasing unreliability. The variables aligned into a pattern that made his stomach clench. He installed a discreet security camera system that weekend while Veronica visited her mother in San Francisco. 6 high-definition units with motion detection, smartphone alerts, and cloud backup, all legally installed on his own property. "Just some extra security," he explained when she noticed the small lens near their front door. "After that GPS thing, I want to be cautious." Veronica nodded absently, already focused on her phone. "Good thinking." The system activated Monday morning. Edward was reviewing structural plans at his office when the first alert arrived. Motion detected at the front entrance. He switched to the live feed and watched his wife leave the house at 10:47 a.m., wearing a dress he'd never seen before. The second alert came at 11:23 a.m., Veronica's car pulling into the driveway. She wasn't alone. Miles Crane stepped out of the passenger seat, his hand briefly touching the small of Veronica's back as they walked toward the house. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakably intimate. A familiarity that spoke of practice, of comfort, of things done many times before. Edward's coffee cup cracked in his grip. The next 3 hours passed in a haze of surveillance footage that stripped away 18 years of marriage like layers of old paint. Miles and Veronica moved through his home with the casual intimacy of lovers. They shared wine from bottles Edward had been saving for special occasions. They laughed at jokes he couldn't hear. They kissed in his kitchen with a passion Edward hadn't seen from his wife in years. At 2:15 p.m., they disappeared into the master bedroom. Edward closed his laptop and walked to his office bathroom. His reflection stared back from the mirror, 44 years old, graying at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and careful attention to detail. A methodical man who'd built his life on precision and trust. He gripped the sink edge until his knuckles went white, waiting for the rage to come. Instead, he felt something colder settling in his chest, a calculating calm that surprised him with its clarity. Edward returned to his desk and opened a new spreadsheet. Column A, evidence. Column B, timeline. Column C, legal implications. Column D, countermeasures. By 5 p.m., he had the framework for what came next. "How was your day, darling?" Veronica asked that evening, kissing his cheek with the same practiced warmth. "Productive," Edward said. "Very productive." "Doctor." Harris Velman's office occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Seabright Hill's perfectly manicured coastline. Edward had chosen him specifically because his father had recommended the therapist years earlier, before a heart attack had ended both their relationship and his father's life. "Betrayal is a unique form of trauma," Velman said, settling into his leather chair. He was a distinguished man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every micro-expression. "It doesn't just hurt, it redefines reality itself." Edward sat across from him, hands folded precisely in his lap. "I haven't said anything about betrayal." "No, but you've described discovering your wife's affair with clinical detachment. Most people would be screaming or crying or breaking things. You're sitting there like you're analyzing a structural engineering problem." "Maybe I am." Velman leaned forward slightly. "What kind of structure are we talking about? A bridge to forgiveness, or something more like demolition?" Edward met the therapist's gaze steadily. "That depends on the load-bearing capacity." "Ah," Velman made a note. "And what happens when a structure can't bear the load?" "Controlled collapse," Edward said. "You don't let it fall randomly and damage everything around it. You plan the demolition carefully, precisely. So only the target structure is destroyed." Their sessions continued weekly. Velman proved to be an excellent listener, with an unusual understanding of what he called strategic emotional processing. He never suggested Edward confront Veronica directly or attempt marriage counseling. Instead, he offered different perspectives. "Revenge isn't about hurting them," he said during their third session. "It's about restoring balance. They took something from you, your trust, your sense of reality, your plans for the future. The question isn't whether they deserve consequences, it's whether you deserve justice." Edward began implementing his plan with the same methodical precision he brought to his professional projects. Phase 1, documentation. He compiled video evidence, financial records, and digital communications that painted a clear picture of the affair's scope and duration. Miles had been using company resources to court Veronica, charging romantic dinners to client entertainment accounts, using the firm's luxury car service for their hotel visits. Phase 2, legal preparation. Edward consulted with 3 different attorneys under various pretexts, learning about divorce law, asset protection, and fraud prosecution. He discovered that California's no-fault divorce laws meant the affair itself wouldn't impact asset division, but financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty were different matters entirely. Phase 3, psychological warfare. "I've been thinking about our relationship," Edward said over dinner on a Thursday evening. Veronica looked up from her phone, where she'd been responding to comments on her latest post about nurturing authentic connections. "Oh?" she said, not quite hiding her wariness. "We've grown apart over the years. Maybe we should consider modernizing our approach." "Modernizing how?" Edward chose his words carefully. "Some couples find that giving each other space to explore other connections actually strengthens their primary relationship. Open marriages, they call them." Veronica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Are you saying you want to see other people? I'm saying maybe we should be honest about what we both want instead of pretending everything is perfect. Her smile was radiant. Edward, that's so evolved of you. I've read about couples who've transformed their relationships this way. It takes real emotional maturity. I thought you might be interested in exploring it. I am, she said quickly. Very interested. That weekend, they celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary at Chez Laurent, the same restaurant where Edward had proposed decades earlier. Veronica wore red silk and diamond earrings he'd given her for Christmas. She laughed at his stories, held his hand across the table, and played the role of loving wife with Academy Award-worthy conviction. This feels like a new beginning, she said over dessert. I love how we're growing together instead of apart. Edward nodded and signaled the waiter for champagne. Actually, I brought some paperwork I'd like you to look at. Estate planning stuff my lawyer suggested updating. Tonight, on our anniversary. Just signatures, nothing complicated. Edward produced a leather portfolio from his briefcase. Standard asset protection documents. My lawyer says married couples should review these annually. Veronica glanced at the papers. Dense legal language about trusts, powers of attorney, and financial authorizations. This looks pretty official. It's just routine, Edward assured her, refilling her champagne glass. Sign where the yellow tabs are. 3 glasses of Dom Perignon had left Veronica relaxed and trusting. She signed her name with flourishes, pausing occasionally to take selfies with the champagne flutes and elaborate floral arrangements. There, she said, sliding the documents back across the table. All done. Edward carefully placed them back in his briefcase. What Veronica had signed weren't estate planning documents. They were financial powers of attorney, business partnership agreements, and, most importantly, a prenuptial amendment that would take effect if either spouse was found to have committed adultery or fraud during the marriage. His lawyer had been very thorough. Happy anniversary, darling, Edward said, raising his glass in a toast. The next phase required careful timing. Edward began staying late at the office, leaving detailed notes about his projects and ensuring all critical files were backed up. He wanted everything in order for what came next. On a foggy Thursday evening, he drove to Seabright Marina and parked his BMW near the boat launch. The fog provided perfect cover as he removed his shoes and dress shirt, leaving them on a bench overlooking the water. He soaked his white cotton undershirt in the bay and left it draped over the railing like evidence of a man who'd walked into the dark water. From his briefcase, he retrieved a letter he'd written to Dr. Vellman. Harris, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The surveillance footage will confirm what you already suspected. 18 years of marriage reduced to a hotel room receipt and my protege's hand on my wife's back. Some men fight. Some men forgive. I'm choosing a third option. The ocean doesn't judge. It just accepts whatever comes to it and makes it disappear. Tell them I was tired of being the only one playing by the rules. Edward? He programmed the email to send automatically in 3 days, giving him time to disappear completely. Then he walked back to his car, drove to the long-term parking garage at San Francisco International Airport, and caught a red-eye flight to Denver using identification documents he'd prepared weeks earlier. Victor Rohn's passport was legitimate, a secondary identity Edward had established through legal name change in Colorado years earlier, when he'd briefly considered relocating for work. Victor had a clean credit history, a modest bank account, and no connection to Edward Langston's increasingly complicated life. From Denver, Victor rented a car and drove to a cabin he'd purchased through a shell corporation in the mountains outside Vail. The property was remote, fully furnished, and had satellite internet that would let him monitor the situation back home. The news of Edward Langston's apparent self-destruction broke on a Friday morning. Seabright Hills police found his car, his clothes, and the soggy note at the marina. The Coast Guard launched a search that would continue for 5 days before being officially suspended due to weather conditions and the low probability of recovery. From his mountain hideout, Edward watched the drama unfold through news websites and social media. Veronica's response was masterfully crafted. Grief-stricken widow, shocked by her husband's hidden depression, dedicated to preserving his memory through charitable work. Her Instagram post garnered 12,000 comments of sympathy. The love of my life is gone, and I can't comprehend a world without him. Edward was brilliant, kind, and devoted to our life together. If anyone is struggling with dark thoughts, please reach out for help. My heart is shattered, but his memory will live on through the lives he touched. The accompanying photo showed her in black, holding a framed picture of their wedding day, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks. Miles played his role equally well. The devoted protege, devastated by his mentor's death, committed to carrying on Edward's legacy at the firm. He gave an interview to the Seabright Hills Gazette about Edward's hidden struggles and the importance of mental health awareness in high-pressure industries. "He was like a father to me," Miles said. "I just wish he'd felt he could talk to someone before making such a final decision." Within a week, Miles had moved into Edward's house to provide support during Veronica's difficult grieving process. The business transition was handled smoothly. Miles took over active management while the probate court sorted out ownership questions. From his mountain cabin, Edward began Phase 4, the unraveling. He started with anonymous tips to the Internal Revenue Service about discrepancies in Langston and Associates' financial records. The company's books showed several suspicious transactions, client entertainment expenses that corresponded exactly to Miles and Veronica's hotel visits, business trips to locations where no clients existed, equipment purchases that couldn't be located. Next, he contacted a freelance journalist who specialized in influencer culture fraud. Through an anonymous email account, he provided detailed financial records, showing how Veronica had been inflating her lifestyle brand's revenue through fake transactions and undisclosed sponsorship deals. The journalist, Sarah Kim, was intrigued by the story of a grieving widow whose social media success seemed built on artificial foundations. Elevated Living with V, How One Influencer's Perfect Life Was Built on Lies, ran in the Pacific Coast Weekly 2 weeks after Edward's disappearance. The article detailed how Veronica had been claiming six-figure brand deals that didn't exist, staging elaborate lifestyle content funded by hidden debt, and potentially using her deceased husband's business accounts to maintain her facade. The response was swift and brutal. Sponsors began canceling contracts. Followers started questioning previous content. Comment sections filled with accusations and analysis of past posts for signs of deception. Veronica posted a tearful video response denying all allegations and threatening legal action against those who would exploit my grief for clicks and views. But the damage was spreading faster than she could contain it. Meanwhile, Miles was dealing with his own problems. Edward had planted evidence suggesting that his protege had been engaging in insider trading, using confidential information about municipal contracts to benefit personal investment accounts. The SEC launched an investigation that would freeze Miles's assets and restrict his ability to conduct business. From his mountain cabin, Edward watched their world collapse with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to structural engineering projects. Every crack had been planned. Every failure point had been calculated. The controlled demolition was proceeding exactly as designed, but he wasn't finished yet. Dr. Velman received Edward's delayed email on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice before forwarding it to the police, but by then, other developments were already in motion. The journalist Sarah Kim had been digging deeper into Veronica's finances and discovered something interesting. The timing of certain luxury purchases, designer clothes, expensive jewelry, professional photo shoots, corresponded exactly with business trips that Miles had charged to Langston and Associates. More intriguingly, she'd found social media posts from other influencers showing Veronica at events and locations during times when she'd claimed to be on digital detox retreats or mindfulness journeys. She was living a completely double life, Sarah explained in her follow-up article. While projecting an image of authentic, mindful living, she was actually engaging in what appears to be systematic fraud and potentially adultery. The second article included photographic evidence of Veronica and Miles together at various locations, time-stamped and geotagged in ways that contradicted both their public statements and their alibis to investigators. Veronica's remaining sponsors fled. Her Instagram account, once a celebration of aspirational living, became a battlefield of comments ranging from supportive to savage. Someone created a parody account called Elevated Lying with V that gained 50,000 followers in its first week. Miles's situation deteriorated even faster. The SEC investigation had uncovered a pattern of suspicious trades that predated Edward's disappearance by several months. Worse, forensic accountants had found evidence that he'd been siphoning client funds through fabricated expenses and inflated invoices. When federal agents arrived at Langston and Associates with search warrants, they discovered that someone had been very thorough in documenting Miles's activities. Computer files, printed emails, financial records, everything was organized and easily accessible, as if someone had wanted the fraud to be discovered. Miles was arrested on a Thursday morning at the office, led away in handcuffs while local news cameras captured every moment. The charges included embezzlement, securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. From his mountain cabin, Edward watched the perp walk on the local news website. Miles looked smaller somehow, his usual confidence replaced by confusion and panic. That evening, Edward received a call on the secure satellite phone he'd been monitoring. The caller ID showed Veronica's number. "I know you're alive," she said without preamble. Her voice was hoarse, desperate. "I know you're watching this happen." Edward said nothing. "Please," she continued. "Just, please, I can explain everything. It wasn't what it looked like. He manipulated me, Edward. He said you didn't love me anymore, that you were planning to leave me anyway." Still silence. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you. I've always loved you. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you think you know, we can fix this. We can start over." Edward ended the call without speaking. 2 days later, Veronica posted what would be her final Instagram story. The video showed her alone in their modernist kitchen, makeup-free, wearing a simple gray sweater. "I need to be honest with you all," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything that's been written about me is true. I've been living a lie for months. I betrayed the most important person in my life, and I've been betraying all of you too." She took a shaky breath. "Edward was a good man, a faithful husband. He deserved better than what I gave him. If he's really gone, then it's my fault. All of it." The video ended abruptly. Within hours, it had been screen captured and shared across social media, generating millions of views and thousands of comments ranging from vindicated to sympathetic. But Edward was no longer watching social media. It was time for the final phase. Miles made bail after 6 days in federal custody. His lawyer, a sharp woman from San Francisco who specialized in white-collar defense, had managed to get him released on his mother's house as collateral. But Miles didn't go home to his mother's house. Instead, he drove to the marina where Edward's self-destruction had supposedly taken place. A security camera caught him breaking into a 40-foot yacht registered to one of his former clients, a client who was currently in Europe and wouldn't be back for months. Miles spent 3 days on the boat, making increasingly frantic phone calls to contacts who might help him disappear permanently. His passport had been confiscated, but he had connections with people who dealt in alternative documentation. On the third night, Edward came to see him. Miles was on the yacht's deck, smoking a cigarette and staring at the black water, when footsteps echoed on the dock behind him. He turned and froze. Edward looked different. Thinner, harder around the edges, wearing dark clothes that made him blend with the shadows. But his eyes were unmistakably familiar, the same calculating intelligence that had made him such a formidable engineer. "Hello, Miles," Edward said quietly. Miles dropped his cigarette. "Jesus Christ, you're supposed to be dead." "Disappointed?" "Relieved," Miles said quickly. "Edward, listen, I can explain everything. Veronica, she what? Seduced you against your will? Forced you to embezzle from my company? Made you steal from our clients?" Miles's face flushed. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" The younger man ran his hands through his hair. "You have no idea what it's been like, working for you all these years, always being the student, never the teacher. Always hearing about your perfect marriage, your perfect house, your perfect life. So you decided to take it." "I fell in love with her," Miles said defensively. "She was lonely, Edward. You were always at the office, always focused on work. She needed someone who actually paid attention to her." Edward stepped closer. In the marina's dim lighting, his face looked carved from stone. "And the embezzlement? Was that also about love? I needed money to compete with you." "She was used to a certain lifestyle. So you stole from clients to impress my wife. It was temporary. I was going to pay it back once the business was officially transferred to me." Edward smiled without humor. "After I was dead, you mean?" Miles's eyes widened. "I never wanted you to die. That was your choice. Was it? Or were you counting on me being too much of a gentleman to fight back? Too civilized to destroy both of you the way you destroyed me? Edward, please. We can work this out. I'll give you everything back. The money, the company, Veronica." The slap came without warning. Edward's open hand connecting with Miles's cheek hard enough to stagger him. Miles stumbled backward, nearly falling over the yacht's railing. "Don't," Edward said quietly. "Mention my wife's name again." Miles touched his face, feeling the sting. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something," Edward said. "Everything that's happened to you, the investigation, the arrest, the evidence they found, I planned all of it. Every document, every financial record, every witness statement. I built the case against you like an engineering project. You set me up. I revealed what you already were. The setup was just presentation." Miles's hand moved slowly toward his jacket pocket. Edward was faster, grabbing the younger man's wrist and twisting until a small pistol clattered onto the deck. "Really?" Edward asked. "After everything, you thought violence was the solution?" He kicked the tool away and pulled Miles closer. In the moonlight, his face looked nothing like the gentle engineer who'd mentored him for 5 years. "Here's what's going to happen," Edward said. "You're going to serve your sentence, every day of it. When you get out, you're going to disappear. New city, new name, new life. If I ever see you again, if you ever contact anyone from our old life, if you ever mention my name or Veronica's name to anyone." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll finish what I started. And next time, there won't be any evidence of self-destruction. There will just be evidence of a tragic boating accident involving a desperate criminal trying to flee federal charges." Miles nodded frantically. "I understand." Edward released him and stepped back. "No, you don't." "But you will." He turned and walked away, leaving Miles alone on the stolen yacht, with the realization that the gentle mentor he'd betrayed had become something much more dangerous. Veronica had retreated to Edward's old lake house, a property he'd inherited from his father and rarely used. It was 2 hours north of Seabright Hills, hidden among pine trees and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. She'd been hiding there for a week when Edward finally came to see her. The house was exactly as he remembered: cedar walls, stone fireplace, windows overlooking the dark water. Veronica had made herself at home, building fires in the evenings and cooking simple meals from the emergency supplies he'd stocked in the pantry. She was sitting on the porch when his headlights swept across the clearing. For a moment, she thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. Her car was blocked by a fallen tree that had mysteriously appeared across the driveway that morning. Edward climbed the porch steps slowly, his hands visible and empty. He'd changed since their marriage, not just physically, but in ways she couldn't quite identify. The gentleman who'd built her dream kitchen and remembered her favorite flowers had been replaced by someone harder, more focused. "Hello, Veronica." She stood up, smoothing her clothes nervously. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. No makeup, no jewelry, no camera-ready perfection. She looked younger somehow, more like the woman he'd married 20 years earlier. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said. "Were you?" "Miles told me before he was arrested. He said you'd planned everything, that you'd been watching us for months." Edward sat down in the wooden chair across from her. "Does it matter now? I want to understand why you did it this way. Why not just confront us? Why not just divorce me?" "Would you have stopped?" The question hung in the air between them. Veronica looked out at the dark lake, considering her answer. "Probably not," she said finally. "Not at first. I would have denied it, blamed you, made excuses. I would have fought for half of everything and tried to destroy your reputation in the process. And Miles? Miles would have convinced me that we deserved each other, that you were the problem, that we were meant to be together." She laughed. Bitterly. "He was very good at making me believe things that weren't true." Edward studied her face in the porch light. "Do you love him?" "I thought I did. But love isn't supposed to make you into someone you don't recognize. Love isn't supposed to require you to destroy other people. What did you think would happen? That I'd never find out?" Veronica was quiet for a long moment. "I thought you didn't care anymore. We'd been growing apart for years. You were always working, always focused on your projects. I felt invisible in my own marriage." "So you made yourself visible to someone else?" "Yes, and I made myself into someone I hated in the process." Edward leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about the money." "What money? The luxury purchases, the fake brand deals, the inflated lifestyle content? That wasn't just about the affair." Veronica's face flushed. I was trying to compete with other influencers. Everyone else seemed to be making more money, living better lives. I started exaggerating things, committing fraud. It started small, a few fake receipts, some inflated numbers. But once I started lying, it became easier to keep lying. Miles said he could help me make it legitimate, that he had connections who could create real brand deals. And you believed him? I wanted to believe him. It's different. Edward stood up and walked to the porch railing. The lake stretched out before them, black water reflecting stars and moonlight. What happens now? Veronica asked. That depends on you. What do you mean? Edward turned to face her. I could turn you in. I have evidence of your fraud, your adultery, your breach of fiduciary duty as a company director. I could destroy what's left of your reputation and make sure you serve prison time. Veronica nodded. I know. Or I could let you disappear. New name, new life, fresh start somewhere far away from here. Why would you do that? Because despite everything, you were my wife for 18 years. You were the woman I loved, even if you forgot how to be her. Veronica started crying. Not the photogenic tears she'd perfected for social media, but ugly, honest sobs that shook her entire body. I'm sorry, she said between gasps. Edward, I'm so sorry for all of it. I know it doesn't matter now, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I lost myself somewhere along the way. Edward watched her cry without moving to comfort her. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust, Veronica. Sorry doesn't undo the damage. I know, but it's a start. He pulled a manila envelope from his jacket and set it on the table between them. New identity documents, clean credit history. Enough money to start over if you're careful. Veronica stared at the envelope. What's the catch? You disappear completely. No contact with anyone from your old life. No social media. No attempts to rebuild your brand or capitalize on this story. You become someone new, and you stay that way. And if I refuse, then I turn you in, and you spend the next 5 to 10 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. Veronica picked up the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were documents for someone named Sarah Morrison. Driver's license, social security card, birth certificate, passport. There was also a bank routing number and account information. Who was Sarah Morrison? She asked. Someone who gets a second chance, Edward said. Don't waste it. He walked down the porch steps toward his car, then paused and looked back. One more thing, he said. The tree blocking your driveway will be cleared tomorrow morning. Pack light. Veronica watched his taillights disappear into the forest. Then she went inside and began sorting through the remnants of her old life, deciding what was worth keeping and what needed to be left behind. 3 months later, Victor Rohn sat in a cafe in Split, Croatia, reading news from home on his tablet. Miles Crane had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple charges. His lawyer had negotiated the deal in exchange for full cooperation and restitution to the defrauded clients. Veronica Langston's disappearance remained a mystery. The FBI had issued a warrant for her arrest, but she seemed to have vanished completely. Some theorized that she'd committed self-destruction out of guilt. Others suspected she'd fled to a non-extradition country with hidden assets. Edward had legally been declared dead 6 months after his disappearance. His estate had been distributed according to his will, most of it going to engineering scholarships and environmental charities, with small bequests to distant relatives who'd never expected to inherit anything. Dr. Harris Velman had retired suddenly after Edward's self-destruction note became public. He'd moved to a small practice in Vermont specializing in grief counseling and trauma recovery. Victor Rohn had been living quietly in Croatia, working as a consulting engineer on infrastructure projects and slowly adapting to his new identity. He'd learned enough Croatian to handle basic conversations, though most of his business was conducted in English. He was finishing his coffee when someone sat down across from him. Victor Rohn, isn't it? Edward looked up to see Dr. Velman settling into the opposite chair. The psychiatrist looked older, more weathered, but his pale blue eyes held the same calculating intelligence Edward remembered. I'm sorry, Edward said carefully. Do we know each other? Velman smiled. We know each other very well, Edward Langston. Edward's hand moved slowly toward his jacket pocket, where he kept a small ceramic knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors. I think you have me confused with someone else. No confusion at all. You planned everything beautifully, by the way. The self-destruction, the evidence, the systematic destruction of everyone who betrayed you. Very thorough, very precise. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. Just like you knew exactly what you were doing when you came to see me for therapy? Looking for validation, perhaps? Professional advice on the psychology of revenge? Edward studied the older man's face. What do you want, doctor? Velman? To thank you, actually. Thank me. Velman leaned back in his chair. Miles Crane was my son. The words hit Edward like a physical blow. He kept his expression neutral through years of engineering training, but his mind raced through implications and connections he'd missed. Your son? Adopted son, technically. I took him in when he was 15, a troubled teenager from a broken home. Brilliant, ambitious, but utterly lacking in moral foundations. Edward's hand remained near his knife. And you're telling me this because I've spent 7 years watching him destroy everything he touched. Relationships, business partnerships, his own future. He was a parasite who consumed opportunities and left wreckage behind. So you used me to eliminate him. Velman's smile was thin and cold. I provided therapeutic support during a difficult time in your life. Any actions you took were entirely your own choice. The therapy sessions. You encouraged the revenge. I encouraged you to process your emotions in healthy ways. Strategic emotional processing, I called it. The fact that your processing led to consequences for those who wronged you, well, that's simply justice. Edward stared at him. You manipulated me. I guided you toward clarity. There's a difference. Your own son. My greatest failure, Velman said quietly. I tried everything. Therapy, structure, opportunities, second chances. Nothing worked. He was fundamentally broken, Edward. A predator who would have continued destroying lives until someone stopped him. So you arranged for me to stop him. I arranged for you to discover your own strength, the capacity for decisive action that most people never find. You could have chosen forgiveness, reconciliation, passive acceptance. Instead, you chose justice. Edward felt the cafe walls closing in around him. What do you want from me now? Nothing, I told you. I'm here to thank you. Miles is where he belongs. Your wife has learned the consequences of betrayal, and you've discovered who you really are underneath all that civilized restraint. And who am I? Velman's pale eyes glittered. Someone who understands that sometimes the only way to restore balance is to burn everything down and start fresh. Someone who's willing to do what needs to be done when the system fails. Edward stood up slowly. I think this conversation is over. Is it? Because I have a proposition for you. Despite himself, Edward hesitated. What kind of proposition? There are other people like Miles. Other parasites who destroy lives and escape consequences. People who manipulate, steal, betray, and hide behind money or lawyers or social connections. And there are other people like you. Good people who've been pushed too far, who deserve justice but don't know how to get it. Edward understood immediately. You want me to become some kind of vigilante consultant. I want you to consider that your talents might be useful to others facing similar situations. The same methodical planning, the same attention to detail, the same willingness to see things through to completion. For money, for justice. Though the two aren't mutually exclusive. Edward looked around the quiet cafe, at the other patrons reading newspapers and checking phones, living their ordinary lives without any idea that two men were discussing the systematic destruction of human beings over espresso and pastries. I'll think about it, he said finally. Velman nodded and stood up. I'll be in touch. He walked away without looking back, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and a business card that contained only a phone number. That evening, Edward walked through the narrow streets of Split's old town, past ancient Roman walls and modern tourist shops. The Adriatic stretched out beyond the harbor, dark water reflecting lights from boats and restaurants. He thought about Velman's proposition, about the cold satisfaction he'd felt watching Miles and Veronica's world collapse, about the person he'd become during those months of planning and execution. The old Edward Langston had been a good man, faithful, hardworking, trusting. He'd believed in fairness and justice and the basic decency of people he cared about. That man had built a successful business, maintained an 18-year marriage, and treated everyone with respect and kindness. That man had also been a fool. Victor Rohn was different. harder, more realistic about human nature. He understood that some people were predators who would take everything you offered and come back for more. He knew that sometimes the only way to deal with betrayal was to betray in return more thoroughly and systematically than your enemies could imagine. But Victor Rohn was also hollow in ways that Edward Langston had never been. The satisfaction of revenge had faded quickly, leaving behind only emptiness and the knowledge that he'd become exactly the kind of person he'd once despised. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Man in Portland needs help with situations similar to yours. Wife, business partner, systematic theft. Interested? Edward stared at the message for a long time. Then he deleted it without responding. But he kept Dr. Velman's card. 2 weeks later, Edward was having dinner at a seaside restaurant when he saw the news report on the television above the bar. A familiar face filled the screen, Miles Crane, thinner and paler than Edward remembered, being led from a prison transport van to a courthouse. The reporter's voice was barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise, but the scrolling text at the bottom of the screen told the story. Miles had been stabbed in federal prison, survived the attack, but suffered permanent damage to his left arm. He was being transferred to a minimum security facility to serve the remainder of his sentence. Edward felt nothing as he watched his former protege struggle with the handcuffs around his wrists. No satisfaction, no regret, no sense of justice served, just emptiness. The next story was about a tech entrepreneur in San Francisco who'd committed self-destruction after being exposed for financial fraud and sexual maltreatment. The man had left behind a wife and 2 young children who would now face both grief and bankruptcy. Edward turned away from the television and focused on his meal, but the story lodged in his mind. How many innocent people were destroyed by the actions of parasites like Miles? How many families suffered because someone with power and charm decided to take what wasn't theirs? His phone buzzed again. Portland's situation resolved without assistance. Man in Phoenix now facing similar betrayal. Business partner and wife, systematic embezzlement, 3 children involved. Interested? This time, Edward didn't delete the message immediately. He read it 3 times, thinking about children who would grow up poor because their father had trusted the wrong people. He thought about a man somewhere in Arizona discovering that his entire life had been built on lies. Finally, he typed a response. Send details. The information arrived within an hour. James Peterson, a 41-year-old architect in Phoenix, had discovered that his business partner and his wife were embezzling from his firm and planning to leave him bankrupt while they started a new life together in Mexico. Peterson had contacted a lawyer, but the legal process would take years and likely result in minimal recovery of stolen funds. By the time justice was served through official channels, the perpetrators would be long gone. Edward studied the files: financial records, photographs, email communications, travel itineraries. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Another successful, trusting man being systematically destroyed by people he'd loved and trusted. But this case was different in one crucial way. Peterson had contacted Dr. Velman before attempting self-destruction. Instead of encouraging self-destruction, the psychiatrist had offered alternative solutions. Edward closed his laptop and walked out onto his apartment's small balcony. Split stretched out below him, ancient and modern buildings mixing together in a city that had survived Roman emperors, medieval kingdoms, and modern wars. Everything could be rebuilt, he realized. Cities, businesses, lives. But some things, once destroyed, could never be restored. Trust, innocence, the ability to love without reservation. He thought about the man he'd been before finding that GPS tracker in his car. That Edward Langston was gone forever, burned away in the controlled demolition of his old life. But maybe Victor Rohn could serve a purpose beyond simple survival. Edward picked up his phone and dialed the number on Dr. Velman's card. "I'll do it," he said when the psychiatrist answered. "But I have conditions." "I'm listening. No eliminating, no permanent physical damage. And the innocent family members are protected." "Agreed. Anything else?" "I work alone. No contact during operations. Payment only after successful completion." "Understood. When can you leave for Phoenix?" Edward looked out at the Adriatic, at the lights reflecting on dark water. In a few hours, he could be on a plane to the United States, back to the country where Edward Langston had died and Victor Rohn had been born. "Tomorrow," he said. The Phoenix operation took 6 weeks to plan and execute. Peterson's business partner, David Wu, had been more careful than Miles, but no less greedy. His affair with Peterson's wife, Linda, had been going on for 2 years while they systematically drained the architectural firm's accounts. Edward approached the case with the same methodical precision he'd used on his own betrayers. Documentation first, financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations. Then legal preparation, identifying fraud statutes, evidence requirements, and prosecution strategies. Finally, psychological warfare, timing revelations for maximum impact and minimal escape opportunities. Wu and Linda never saw it coming. One morning, Wu arrived at the office to find FBI agents waiting with search warrants. Linda discovered that her accounts had been frozen and her credit cards canceled while she was shopping for furniture for the Mexican condo she and Wu had purchased with stolen money. The evidence was overwhelming because Edward had made sure it was organized and presented professionally. Wu received 12 years for embezzlement and money laundering. Linda received 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. Peterson kept his business, his children, and most of his assets. He also kept his life, which had been Dr. Velman's primary concern when he'd first reached out for help. Edward collected his fee, $200,000 transferred to a Cayman Islands account, and returned to Croatia. But he didn't stay long. Within a month, Dr. Velman had sent him details about a case in Seattle, then one in Dallas, then Miami. Each operation was different, but the pattern remained consistent. Successful people betrayed by those closest to them, facing financial ruin and emotional devastation, while their betrayers prepared to escape consequences. Edward would spend weeks studying the situation, months executing the plan, and days watching everything collapse exactly as he'd calculated. He became very good at it. After 18 months of operations, Edward had helped destroy the lives of 23 people who'd made their living by betraying others. He'd also saved the lives of 11 clients who'd been on the verge of self-destruction when Dr. Velman first contacted them. The work was profitable. Edward had accumulated over $3 million in offshore accounts. More importantly, it was purposeful in ways his engineering career had never been. Instead of building structures, he was rebuilding justice. But it was also isolating. Victor Rohn lived alone, worked alone, and trusted no one except the voice on the other end of encrypted phone calls. He had no friends, no relationships, no life beyond the next operation. That changed in Prague. The target was a hedge fund manager named Thomas Brennan, who'd been systematically defrauding elderly investors, while his wife conducted insider trading operations through shell companies. The client was Brennan's former business partner, whose father had lost his retirement savings to their schemes. Edward was conducting surveillance at a cafe near Brennan's hotel when someone sat down across from him. A woman in her 30s with dark hair and green eyes, wearing a simple black dress that managed to be both elegant and unremarkable. "You're not a tourist," she said in accented English. "Neither are you," Edward replied. She smiled. "I'm Elena." "And you're the man who's been following Thomas Brennan for the past week?" Edward's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Elena raised her hands to show they were empty. "I'm not here to stop you," she said. "I'm here to help." "Help with what?" "Thomas Brennan destroyed my family's business in Bulgaria 5 years ago. We've been tracking him ever since, waiting for the right opportunity." Edward studied her face, looking for signs of deception. What kind of opportunity?" "The kind that ensures he never hurts anyone again." They talked for 3 hours. Elena Petrov was a former prosecutor who turned to private investigation after Brennan's financial schemes had corrupted the officials who should have prosecuted him. She'd been following his operations across Eastern Europe, documenting crimes that would never see official prosecution. "He's untouchable through legal channels," she explained. "Too much money, too many connections, too many politicians in his pocket. But men like that have weaknesses too, such as pride, greed, the belief that they're smarter than everyone else." Edward found himself intrigued by more than just her investigative skills. Elena had the same calculating intelligence he'd developed, the same willingness to work outside official systems, but she'd retained something he'd lost, a sense of purpose beyond personal survival. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "Partnership. I handle European operations, you handle American ones. We share intelligence, resources, and risks. And profits? And justice. They work together on the Brennan operation." Elena's contacts in Bulgarian law enforcement provided evidence of previous crimes, while Edward's systematic approach ensured that Brennan's current schemes were documented and presented to authorities in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Brennan was arrested in Prague and extradited to the United States, where he faced charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. His wife was arrested simultaneously in London, caught trying to transfer stolen funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The operation was Edward's most successful to date, but more importantly, it had been a collaboration rather than a solo project. Working with Elena reminded him that isolation wasn't strength, it was just another form of prison. They met again 6 months later in Vienna, then in Berlin, then in Amsterdam. Each operation brought new challenges and new successes. Elena's European connections, combined with Edward's American resources, created opportunities neither could have achieved alone. Somewhere between Budapest and Barcelona, Edward realized he was falling in love. It was a dangerous emotion for someone in his line of work. Love required trust, and trust created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies or clients. But Elena understood the risks better than anyone, and she'd chosen to take them anyway. "We could stop," she said one evening as they walked along the Danube. "We have enough money to disappear completely. New identities, quiet lives, no more operations." "Is that what you want?" Edward asked. "I want whatever allows us to stay together without destroying each other." Edward thought about the question for weeks. They could disappear. Victor Rohn and Elena Petrov could fade away, leaving behind only bank account numbers and false identities. They could buy a house somewhere warm and safe, maybe start a consulting business that didn't involve destroying people's lives. But then, Doctor Vellman would call with another case. Another betrayed client on the verge of self-destruction. Another situation where predators were about to escape consequences for devastating innocent lives. "One more operation," Edward said finally. "Something big enough to make a real difference." Elena smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." The final operation took them back to the United States, to a case that was larger and more complex than anything Edward had attempted before. A pharmaceutical executive named Jonathan Walsh had been systematically bribing doctors, falsifying research data, and price gouging life-saving medications while his wife and brother-in-law embezzled funds through fake charities. The client was Walsh's former research director, Dr. Sarah Chen, whose attempts to expose the company's practices had resulted in her being framed for data theft and blacklisted from the industry. Chen had contacted Dr. Vellman after her third self-destruction attempt. "This isn't just personal betrayal," Elena pointed out as they reviewed the case files. "These people are eliminating patients for profit." Edward nodded. The scope of Walsh's crimes went far beyond anything they'd handled before. Hundreds of people had died because they couldn't afford medications that cost pennies to produce, but sold for thousands of dollars. Thousands more had received ineffective or dangerous treatments based on falsified research. "The evidence exists," Edward said, "but it's buried in shell companies, offshore accounts, and encrypted communications. We'd need months to piece it all together. Or we could make them expose themselves." They developed a plan that combined elements from every previous operation. Financial pressure, legal exposure, psychological manipulation, and strategic timing all coordinated to create a cascade failure that would destroy Walsh's empire completely. The operation began with anonymous tips to the FDA about discrepancies in Walsh's research data. While federal investigators began examining laboratory records, Edward and Elena worked to expose the financial crimes through carefully planted evidence and leaked documents. But Walsh was more dangerous than their previous targets. He had connections in law enforcement, political allies, and enough money to hire private security teams. When he realized he was under investigation, he began fighting back. Elena was kidnapped outside her hotel in Chicago. The men who took her weren't professional butchers. They were private contractors hired to send a message. But they underestimated both her training and Edward's response. Edward found her 12 hours later in an abandoned warehouse on the city's south side. She'd managed to free herself from her restraints, but was trapped in a building surrounded by armed guards. The rescue was swift and brutal. Edward had spent years learning to destroy people through legal and financial means, but he'd never forgotten the more direct skills he'd acquired during military service before becoming an engineer. The guards were incapacitated efficiently and silently. Elena was hurt, but alive. More importantly, she was angry. "Walsh made this personal," she said as Edward bandaged her wrists. Now we finish him properly. The final phase of the operation was a coordinated media blitz that exposed every aspect of Walsh's crimes simultaneously. Research fraud, price manipulation, bribery, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy charges were filed in multiple jurisdictions, making it impossible for Walsh's lawyers to control the narrative or negotiate favorable plea deals. Walsh's pharmaceutical company collapsed within a week. Its stock became worthless, its executives were arrested, and its assets were frozen pending criminal proceedings. Walsh himself was arrested at his Hamptons estate while trying to destroy evidence. Dr. Chen was vindicated, her research was published, and the patients who'd been denied life-saving medications finally received justice. The case became a landmark prosecution that led to industry-wide reforms and new regulations protecting whistleblowers. But the personal cost had been higher than either Edward or Elena had anticipated. The warehouse incident had reminded them both that their work involved real danger from people who had nothing left to lose. "This was the last one," Edward said as they watched news coverage of Walsh's arrest from their hotel room. Elena nodded. "I know." They'd accumulated enough evidence to destroy dozens of other targets, but they'd also made enough enemies to ensure that continuing would eventually get them eliminated. It was time to disappear for real. "Doctor." Velman called Edward one final time as they prepared to leave the United States permanently. "The Walsh operation was exceptional work," the psychiatrist said. "You've saved hundreds of lives." "We're done," Edward replied. "Both of us. Don't contact me again." "I understand. But I want you to know that you've created something important, a model for justice that works when official systems fail. Find someone else to continue it. Perhaps I will. But there will never be another partnership like yours and Elena's. You found something most people in our business never discover, which is that revenge is hollow, but justice shared is purpose." Edward ended the call and destroyed the phone. Then, he and Elena boarded a flight to New Zealand, where Victor Rohn and Elena Petrov would disappear forever. 5 years later, Edward Miller and Elena Miller owned a small vineyard in the hills outside Auckland. They grew organic grapes, made award-winning wine, and lived quietly among people who knew nothing about their previous lives. Edward had aged well. The constant tension and hypervigilance of his operational years had faded, replaced by the peaceful satisfaction of work that created rather than destroyed. Elena had learned to smile without calculating threats and to trust their neighbors without running background checks. They still followed news from the United States occasionally. Miles Crane had been released from prison and worked at a construction company in Oregon under his real name, living in a small apartment and avoiding any contact with his former life. Veronica, now Sarah Morrison, had opened a small bakery in Vermont and seemed to have found genuine happiness in anonymity. Dr. Velman had retired completely and moved to a cabin in Montana, where he spent his time writing memoirs that would never be published. Jonathan Walsh had died in federal prison after 2 years of appeals and legal maneuvering. His pharmaceutical company's assets had been liquidated to compensate sufferers, and new regulations had prevented similar schemes from emerging. The work Edward and Elena had done continued through other people using different methods, but the immediate need for their particular skills had passed. On a warm autumn evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the vineyard golden, Elena asked the question that had been unspoken between them for months. "Do you ever regret any of it?" Edward considered the question seriously. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that people like Miles and Walsh existed in the first place, but I don't regret stopping them." "Even the cost?" The old Edward Langston had to die for any of this to be possible. "Maybe that's just the price of real justice. You have to be willing to sacrifice who you were to become who the situation requires." Elena took his hand. "And who are you now?" Edward looked out at their vineyard, at the vines they'd planted and tended, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and shared purpose. "I'm a man who learned that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to save others first," he said. "And sometimes the only way to find peace is to make sure the right people pay for their crimes." The sun set behind the hills, and Edward Miller went inside to help his wife prepare dinner for the quiet life they'd earned through methods the world would never know about.